professor at MIT, where he's also an entrepreneur, and he works with a lot of big companies, including Facebook, including 1-800-Flowers, whose chairman is the chairman of the company that owns Techonomy, by the way. He's a data nerd. He's basically an economist by training, specializing in econometrics, but he's also very deep in social science, which is, I think, where the secret sauce comes, that he's kind of brought the economics and social science together to try to figure out what this really important set of systems are doing to and for us. And I meant to say, at MIT, he directs the initiative on the digital economy and the social analytics lab. So Sinan, welcome. But before I unleash you, I want to read one paragraph from your book, which is not out yet, by the way. The book isn't coming out till September, and there's some parts of it that we won't reveal today. But I think this gives you a sense of the level at which he's trying to deal with the phenomena of social media and what it's doing to and for us. He says, social media is consuming us, our time and our attention, because we are neurologically wired to use it. The hype machine is designed to take advantage of our psychological and neurophysiological needs for socialization, belonging, and social approval. It's governed by economic network effects that perpetuate its growth and encourage a winner-take-all competition among networks like Facebook. And in order to appropriate value, the platforms have designed the hype machine to lock us in. These three factors, the hype machine's psychological, economic, and technical hooks, accelerate our adoption and sustained use of social media. They also make it hard to imagine a world without the hype machine. So it was really that particular point that we really, the world is altered by this reality. So Sinan, is that kind of and that, by the way, that was on page 96. That's deep into his book. Why did you write it? And what is it you're trying to do? And what is your concern and deepest interest here?
So I'll tell you, I began my PhD at MIT in the year 2000. And right around then, in 2000, 2001, I was taking two courses. One was an econometrics or a statistics course that began with the assumption in all of our models that all of the observations are independent and identically distributed. So there's no interdependence amongst the people or companies and the data sets that we're studying. And at the same time, I was taking sociology of strategy courses that were about social networks and how people are connected to one another. And I realized in that moment, I kind of had an epiphany that a lot of the economic approaches to understanding society have fundamentally ignored the extreme interdependence that exists due to technology. And at the time in 2001, there was no Facebook, but there was Friendster and there was MySpace and there was email. And I decided in that moment that these new technologies that sort of, instead of connect us to a larger pool of information, like websites on the internet, but that connect us directly to each other, is going to kind of revolutionize society in so many ways. And I began studying social media in 2001, before Facebook was founded. And I went to my advisor and I said, listen, I think that this is going to be big. He said, it's Eric Brynjolfsson, who's
a friend of Techonomy, by the way, who's been on our stage many times.
So Eric is a longtime friend and mentor, was my PhD advisor. And he said, well, you know, Sinan, I don't know much about digital social networks, but you seem really interested in it. You know, let's go for it. And I've been studying it ever since. So really the book, I've been studying the economic, social, and technical impacts of social media for 20 years. I've published a lot of research on the topic. And I decided at some point that, you know, in the last, say, about 5 years, I think we've all experienced how impactful social media is. And I don't just mean on our democracy. Obviously, that's front and center of everyone's mind today. Fake news, impact on elections, foreign interference, but also I have a 6-year-old son. What does it do to our brains? How does it interface with our, neurological circuits? What is the impact on, say, business? How does it direct the ebb and flow of who wins in the marketplace? How does it affect our public health? How is it related to the coronavirus pandemic through fake news, or was it related to the measles outbreaks in 2019? And I think that people are really hungry at the level of policymakers, at the level of business leaders, and at the level of just people who have children. They want to know what are the effects of social media in society, and how can we steer it towards good and away from bad. And so I've been looking at this for 20 years, and so I decided to write a book about it. And I'll say the purpose or the mission of the book is to really talk about and to develop from first principles an understanding of how we can achieve its promise while avoiding its peril. That is the goal of the book, is what can we do to harness it for good and to avoid all of the negative consequences that we really do see in society.
Well, it's nice that you believe that's possible, because that's not a universally held view, including them. Certainly, it's interesting if you look at the poll, which we've just been conducting among people on this Zoom, the overwhelming majority says Facebook's influence on American society is either somewhat or very negative. We need more competition, which I know you agree with. Overwhelming majority disagree with Facebook's policy on political ads. And people are roughly divided into whether they use it heavily or not. But yeah, I think the single biggest thing that, and I've been reading your book, I haven't finished it, but I read most of it. And the single biggest thing that I took away, even after myself having been thinking about this for 15 years, is that essentially what's happened with the social systems, the digital social systems that we are immersed in, is that they are defining the world as we live in it. And I think that's something that people don't generally think of in those terms. But so you believe we could find the promise, not the peril. But as you have spent your 20 years studying this, have you become more alarmed?
Oh, absolutely. So I would say that I'm fairly well aligned with the poll results here. So just because I believe there is promise doesn't mean that we are achieving it and avoiding the peril now. I actually think the opposite. I think that we are heading, we are the Titanic heading for the iceberg. But my belief is that that's not a fundamental characteristic of the technology. It's a fundamental characteristic of the way we are using, defining, and regulating the technology now. I don't believe that it is an inevitability that social media can only have negative effects in society. And I believe that there are very concrete things that we can do to make it work better for us than the way it is currently working now.
Interesting, in Biden's, I don't know if he actually sent the letter that he was supposed to send, maybe you do, but Biden's campaign was sending a letter according to the Times. The Times has a piece today that says he was going to send it yesterday, and I'm looking at the physical paper because I'm an old school person. But one of the things that Biden ostensibly now is saying publicly is that Section 230 ought to be eliminated, which I thought was kind of amazing, if I read that correctly. Because many people generally that I know say that to do that would effectively make the economics of social media impossible and destroy it. Which Section 230 is the rule that allows any kind of digital platform to not bear legal responsibility for speech that takes place within it. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, civil liability. So obviously they would bear criminal liability if there is criminal, it really only protects them from civil liability. Basically what Section 230 does is it shields internet companies from lawsuits pertaining to what users are saying on their platforms. And it doesn't just apply to Facebook. It also applies to the commenting section of the New York Times. It also applies to all of Wikipedia. It also applies to all of the reviews on Amazon. And so the problem with this is that people say, well, Facebook is a publisher and therefore should be regulated like a publisher. But the scale of having user-generated content being created at the scale that it's created by 3 billion users every day, moderating that is not the same thing as the New York Times being responsible for what its op-ed editors are writing in the op-ed section of the New York Times. It's a completely different animal. And it also really does apply much more broadly than just social media. It's true of very large swaths of the internet. I had not seen that report about the Biden letter.
Maybe I got that wrong. Maybe someone can text me if they think I got that. It's actually not in the Times piece today, but I saw it somewhere online. But these issues are so actively being discussed. But what about the question of regulation generally? I mean, you clearly, everyone I know pretty much, even including Mark Zuckerberg, says regulation is needed.
Yes.
It's the question of what form should it take? And I think one of the messages I take away from your book is the systems are so complex, politically, economically, neurologically, that to come up with the right form of regulation is not going to be easy.
Correct. So I have to say before we talk about regulation, I just want to highlight what the quote that you read. It was a very astute grab of a single quote. It really does drive home a particular message. So what that quote talked about was the neurological hooks, the economic hooks, and the technical hooks. Each one of those gets a chapter in the book. And the neurological hook is about how social media is designed to take advantage of the human evolution of the social brain. Okay, so when you look at cognitive anthropology and you read about how human beings have evolved and why we have come to dominate the planet, one of the leading theories is the social brain hypothesis, that it's our complex ways of socializing that have allowed us to evolve to be so dominant and intelligent. Not our manual dexterity or our logical reasoning, but our socializing. And if that's true, then a technology that puts us in touch with trillions of social signals every day is like tossing a lit match into a pool of gasoline. And so we have to understand the neurological impacts that social media has on our brains. And so there's a whole chapter dedicated to that.
Go on, sorry.
The notion of the economics is about network effects. And so the concept there is that the reason why Facebook is a monopoly is because the fundamental underlying economic market structure of social media is tippy. And it's tippy because of network effects, and you can't really understand how to regulate social media until you understand that fundamental aspect of the economics of the underlying market structure. So there's a whole chapter on that. And then the technical hook is all about interoperability. So it's all about whether or not we own our data, we own our social networks or not, or whether Facebook owns those things. And so with those three hooks as a backdrop for how we got where we are, only then can you think about how do we unwind what we've done and how do we regulate. And on the question of regulation, you're absolutely right. I think it's a generic question to say, how do we regulate Facebook? I think what's better is to ask, how do we regulate privacy? How do we think about political speech? How do we think about free speech? How do we think about protection from civil liability? How do we think about stopping fake news? Each one of these things is its own massive undertaking, and each one of them is covered in the book one by one.
Well, you were using the word labyrinth to describe the problem in a dialogue we were having this morning by text. And to overlay yet another element of that labyrinth, which I think about a lot, which is extremely problematic, is that this is a global system that is governed by the laws of over 190 countries. The chances that they'll all get it right is very small, and for all of the whatever negative effects Americans might be feeling, those effects are being felt in many cases even more in pronounced ways in many, many other countries, because there are many other countries for which, even more than in the United States, Facebook in particular is the only form of media. which is one of the reasons, like in Myanmar, it became such an issue, or Sri Lanka, Philippines, even India. It's the predominant form of media in most of these countries, and that's really problematic. I want to just read one thing, though, again from this Times article. The director of communications for Trump's campaign, responding to Biden's call for changing the rule, at least, that politicians can be dishonest in political ads, which is one of the real controversial policies Facebook currently has. He says, Tim Murtaugh says to the Times, the American people can think for themselves. They don't want big tech companies telling them how to think. Now, having just been reading your book, I was wondering whether that's a true statement.
You know, do you mean? I'm not exactly sure what that person is meaning by that quote. Does he mean?
Well, he means that they shouldn't change their rules about political speech, paid political speech being allowed to be dishonest. But your book goes so deeply into the psychological, neurological hooks that these systems are designed to exploit in our brains, that I really am not sure I even accept the basic line that people using these systems can fully think for themselves. I'm curious for your view.
Well, I mean, I think that political speech is a very specific form of speech. And I think that there is need for regulation of political speech for a variety of reasons. Okay, so the reasons that we regulate political speech in this country while potentially providing a lot more freedom to other types of speech is because we want an equitable system of a persuasion market during elections and during the functioning of democracy to be sort of unencumbered and have certain guide rails that enable a level playing field, that enable transparency of information. That's why political speech is regulated in advertising and other places. I really have no idea why political speech would be immune from those regulations on social media when it is regulated in those ways, for instance, on television or in print media. I can't think of any logical argument why that would be true. Now, this notion of whether or not, and by the way, the other reason why we have to be vigilant about the regulation of political speech is because we want the speech that happens around our democracy to be uninfluenced by outside forces, right? So protecting our democracy from foreign interference is another big reason for the regulation of political speech. We don't want foreign money directing political speech in the United States. That is another reason why it should be regulated.
You know, well, I guess I definitely want to get into talking about fake news, and we do want to hear from many of the very well-informed people that are on this Zoom. But I guess I'd first want to ask you, how worried are you about the American political process, given the way these systems function right now and the fact that we have a historically consequential election looming?
I am very worried. So we are 6 months from possibly the most consequential election of our generation, maybe.
No, it's not possibly. It is.
It is, right? Okay, so, you know, I'm being conservative in my language, and you can tell that even that is difficult to do at this point. And yet we're in the middle of a once-in-a-100-year global pandemic. We have a tremendous amount of generally justifiable civil protest, all happening at once while we have very little has been done either in the executive branch or in the legislative branch to protect our elections from foreign interference. We know that there was foreign interference in the last election, and we know that that's just being escalated in this election. And so what is going to happen in 6 months during this election? I mean, we just saw 4-hour lines in a primary in Georgia yesterday or the day before yesterday. I am very worried. And I think that we are sort of idle. We're not doing enough legislatively. at the state level, at the federal level, to protect our elections, and to even think about social media manipulation. We wrote an article that was published in Science last September about a 4-point blueprint for how we protect our elections from social media manipulation. Almost none of those recommendations have been implemented in any way since we wrote the article. And there's a big debate between congressional Democrats and Republicans about election legislation, funding for election protection in the states, and so on.
So you've said what we should do in that article, but is there really any likelihood that we're going to do much of that stuff?
You know, I think that there is certainly we have the capacity and the capability to do it. The question is, do we have the political will to do it? Do the people who are in positions to make that happen, do they have the political will to do it? You would have to ask Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, President Trump, and so on, whether, you know, I mean, we hear from the FEC that it's very difficult to tamper with the election, right? Because we have a federalist system, all the states do it differently, all the voting systems are different in every state, so to have a systematic attack is very difficult. I don't really buy that at all, because a few changes and a few targeted attacks in a few states could be very effective. I also don't see why, you know, why we don't do risk limiting audits of elections, you know, paper ballots and risk limiting audits of elections. These types of just common sense things are not vast, don't require vast resources, and could really go a long way to protecting our elections. Maybe one day we'll do it. Do I think we'll do it between now and November? I think the chances are quite low, and that's part of the reason why I'm so worried.
One of the things that we've all heard about and that you address in some detail in the book is the way that Russia consciously and deliberately and very methodically and quite intelligently manipulated information flows in 2016 and in other elections around the world, by the way. And then you had done that study about why fake news, which is one of the primary tools Russia used, is so powerful. That's kind of one of the things that put you on the map and probably let you get the book contract. And I know you have a whole chapter early in the book about this. Explain the basics of what you learned with your colleagues about fake news and why it's so consequential, speaking of that word.
Yeah, I mean, so in 2016, we know that Russia sent about 126, sent fake news to about 126 million people on Facebook, 20 million people on Instagram. They put out 10 million tweets and about 43 hours of misinformation on YouTube. In 2020, the problem is it's not just Russia. Now it's also China and Iran. It's during a global pandemic and civil unrest in the United States with 4-hour lines in a Georgia primary. And the attacks are more sophisticated. So Russia has moved, we know from the intelligence community that Russia has moved its attacking servers from outside of the country onto US soil because it's difficult for our surveillance systems to surveil domestically. They have a lot more latitude to surveil internationally. Russia has infiltrated Iran's cyber war department and so on. So the things that are happening now are more sophisticated, broader, involve more countries in a time when we're more vulnerable because we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're in the middle of civil unrest, we have 4-hour lines at the polling places and so on. And we're no less, our democracy is no less hardened to these attacks now than in 2016. When we studied the spread of fake news in 2018, what we studied was we looked at all of the true and false verified news stories that ever spread on Twitter from its inception in 2006 to 2017, so 10 years worth of data. And what we found was that the false news traveled farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied. And it was particularly true for political false news. And in fact, when we looked at why this was the case, we first thought, well, maybe it's the characteristics of the people spreading the news. Maybe they have more followers or follow more people, or maybe they're more often verified users of Twitter. And we looked at each one of these in turn, and what we found was that the opposite was true, that the spreaders of false news had fewer followers, followed fewer people, were less often verified, and so on. So none of these things could explain the spread of false news. And in fact, false news diffused so much further, faster, deeper, and more broadly, despite these characteristics, not because of them. So we had to come up with another explanation. What we looked at was the novelty of the information and the surprise and the salaciousness and the sort of emotional, visceral reaction that it engendered was really a driving factor. That basically false news is more often surprising, more often sort of disgusting or just anger provoking. And we as human beings, we are drawn to that like flies to a fly lamp. And we are much more likely to share novel information, to share surprising information for a variety of reasons. We are conditioned socially to have, our attention is drawn to what's novel in the environment. And in addition, sociologically, we gain in status by sharing information that other people don't know, because it makes us look like we're in the know and that we have access to some sort of inside information. All of these psychological factors favor fake news over the truth. And
shockingly, you discovered that it's not just that it spreads faster, it spreads 6 times faster than the truth. 6x. And as you point out, political news of all categories of fake news travels faster than other kinds of fake news. That is very worrying in so many ways. If anybody has questions or comments, they're welcome to text them to Josh in Zoom here, and we will try to come to you. You talk about norms. You know, you also talk a lot in the book about how we can't just say social media is impacting us, that we are culpable. Explain what you mean by that. And so aside from the regulatory side, what can we do as individuals?
Great question. So I think that there's this one way of thinking about technology and society, and I've been thinking about technology and society for many decades at MIT and as the director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy. And one sort of narrative in the world is technological determinism, right? So that technology impacts us and we have no control over it. This is sort of Elon Musk's, idea that AI is going to destroy the world. The idea that robots are coming for our jobs and we can't do anything about it. But really, it's the decisions we make on how we structure, use, regulate technology that determine how technology influences our lives. And so to take the technologically deterministic view of social media or any technology in the world sort of makes us feel it at once absolves us of the responsibility of acting properly with technology, both as regulators, consumers, and users, but it also makes us feel completely inept, that we can't do anything, that somehow technology is going to impact us and we're not part of this equation. I think that's not true, and I think that that's a counterproductive way of looking at technology. So in the book, I describe what I call the hype loop between machine intelligence and human decision-making, and both of them play a role. So the machine intelligence analyzes what we do, who we friend, what we read, what we like, what we buy, and then uses machine learning to make suggestions for us. Who should we friend? What should we read next? What should we buy next? Who we should vote for next? Advertisements and so on. But then we act on that. We make choices on what to read, what to share, what to believe, what to buy, who to vote for. And then the machine listens to all of that and then again analyzes and makes more suggestions. So there's this loop of analyze our decisions, behaviors, and actions, suggest new ones, and then we decide and act. And that hype loop is what generates sales for companies, votes for politicians, outcomes in elections, and so on. And so half of that entire process is our action. It's our activity. And yes, algorithms are designed to take advantage of our neurological impulses. However, if we designed the systems in a way, and if we were more conscious of the way that we use these systems it could go a long way in this hype loop. And what does that translate into? Well, it translates into things like digital literacy. It translates into things like having the platforms design systems that are transparent. In other words, labeling I'll give you one example, okay? When you go to buy food at the grocery store, it is extensively labeled by law. It tells you how many calories it has, how many trans fats it has, whether it was even produced in a facility that handles wheat or peanuts in case you have an allergy. They're required to put those labels on the food that you put in your body, but there are no labels on the information that we consume on social media. Why not? Why don't we know what the provenance of this information is? What is the likelihood that it's true or false? How often the source of this information has given true or false information in the past? What is the editorial policy of the source of this information? So labeling information the way we label food to consume would go a long way to helping us then make better decisions about what to believe, what to share, and so on.
Isn't that what Twitter just did that Facebook refused to do, by the way?
Absolutely, and this is perfect example. So in 2018, I gave a TED Talk where I suggested labeling, and now 2 years later, we see the two major platforms taking opposing directions on labeling. This is a very good example of the debates we're having in society about the very concepts that I'm describing in the book.
Yeah. Josh, anybody you'd like to go to, or shall I just keep
Sure.
plugging
Well,
away?
let's try to get a couple of voices in here. And let's start with Dick Reisman. I know he had two questions. I'm allowing you to talk now. Dick, you should be able to unmute yourself if you're there.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's sort of two things I'd like maybe you can address. One is on the basic question of Section 230. Actually, there's three that if I can do it quickly.
Just do it quickly.
Pick the ones you think you can answer it quickly. I mean, Section 230, the real issue is there's a middle ground. There's a kind of automated moderation that the platforms do. So Section 230 doesn't address that, and there are suggestions that it be rewritten to require that to be treated as moderation, which is not given a free harbor, because there's algorithmic filtering moderation, not just posting. So if that question is clear, the other, the Bell system is a really good analogy to a very complex system that has similar network effects and similar issues of modularity and interoperability. And the way that was treated by an agency like the FCC, I think, is a good model. And then the last question is, there's algorithms like Google's that can be adapted to social media to change this hype cycle, to adapt and figure out who has a reputation for being sensible, who has a reputation for being a bot or stupid, and change your filtering accordingly, rather than based on selling advertising.
Yep.
Really informed questions, Dick. Thank you for this.
Fantastic.
Dick is an expert in this area, obviously, as you can tell.
Well, fantastic questions, Dick. I think you're somebody who would very much like this book because I get into all the weeds on these. Briefly, let me take those in reverse order. So the concept of the algorithm of reputation is one that I get into in the book a great deal, right? So this notion of knowing the sort of reliability of the sources of information is important, and being transparent about that, I think, is very important as well. So that is addressed in the book, and you know, a whimsical question is, why is there only a like button? You know, why isn't there a truth button, or a this guy taught me something button, or this guy is trustworthy button? We built a system that only values popularity, but where did we come up with that as the prime directive? That
a bunch of engineers who weren't very high in EQ came up with it. Yeah.
Exactly. But that's not an inevitability. It doesn't have to be that way. Okay. So great question on that. Now, the Bell system, great question. I have an entire chapter dedicated to this, chapter 5. And then chapter 12 that goes into solutions talks directly about this. So I completely agree with you that when I refer to the underlying market structure at the beginning of the conversation, that's what I was talking about. And what I mean here is that in markets with network effects, when you have the ability, when you limit interoperability and you don't legislate interoperability, it leads to tippy markets. It leads to monopolies in that market. And sure, you could break up one of these companies, but that wouldn't necessarily solve the problem of this market tipping to the next monopoly unless you legislate interoperability. So in the book, I advocate this and actually describe how it would be done. I think it's analogous. So the concepts of data portability, social graph portability, and identity portability are front and center of that. I think it needs to be legislated, and it's all described in the book. And then your other question was Section 230. So, I think that the issue here is that Section 230 provides protection in order for those types of companies to be able to do moderation. So protection from civil liability for the moderation that they do allows them to do the moderation without fear that a decision they make one way or another will engender a lawsuit. And so Section 230 is what gives them the power to moderate and to get rid of child pornography and so on. Now, what I advocate in the book is a deliberative process. So I do believe that free speech is important, but I also do believe that speech can cause harm, and there is equal protection under the law. And so I believe that speech that causes harm should be regulated. And so what I think is that instead of deciding which actual speech is harmful or should be protected by the First Amendment, the question we have to ask a priori is who should be making those decisions? And what I believe is that it shouldn't be a 5-person politically appointed commission like the FEC or the FCC. It should be the legislative and judicial branches of government. I think that we should pass laws that say this kind of speech is harmful and therefore it should be regulated. Or we should have a court like the Supreme Court decide this is an example of speech that is protected under the First Amendment or it isn't. I don't believe a 5-person FCC politically appointed panel is the right place to decide whether Section 230 protection should apply or not. That's exactly what Trump's executive order does, by the way.
We want to go to some of the other people, but what about the 20-person Facebook imposed and owned Supreme Court? Any opinion quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, I have much more, I would like this to be as representative as possible. We elect our congressmen and women, and judicial appointments are made by people that we've elected. That's the way we designed it from the beginning for a reason.
Okay. We have a question from one of our members, Jane Lentz, asking, is there a technological fix to a cultural problem? I guess similarly to AI and bias, right? I mean, we historically made bad decisions as humans. In theory, you could apply AI to make better decisions, but I think we've seen that there's a lot of bias in the data and we perpetuate some of these decisions. So is there truly a technological fix to a cultural problem?
Well, so I go through all of the evidence in the book for whether social media creates filter bubbles or not, whether it drives polarization or not. We've had a lot of, I mean, Eli Pariser is a friend of mine. He wrote The Filter Bubble, a book that I think is fantastic and really well written. But at the time he wrote it, there was no research on whether filter bubbles were true or not. It was all anecdotes about some web searches that he did in a systematic way, but there wasn't peer-reviewed experimental research on it. But now there is. And it's all sort of covered in the book. And the answers are very intriguing about the extent to which the algorithms drive polarization, drive filter bubbles, and so on. The answer to that question, I think, is both, in the sense that I think technology has a role to play, and I think society has a role to play. Technology amplifies and sort of highlights biases that we have as human beings, but it also perpetuates to some extent and accentuates biases that we have as human beings. I think there is some evidence of sort of rabbit holes of extreme content and polarization, but I adjudicate all of that evidence in the book, and there are some very surprising answers to those questions that we now have data on that we didn't just 5 years ago.
So you are the judge. Anyway, we've got to wrap momentarily, but Catherine Steiner-Adair is on this Zoom and is an expert in how young people in schools and students respond to social and this kind of problem. And when you spoke earlier about how we've got to educate yourself, obviously what happens with children is really urgently important in that. So what she asks is, what would you want your son's school to teach him about this in middle and high school, or even in elementary school?
Oh my gosh, what a great question, and what a thoughtful question. As I said, I have my son finished first grade today. I will tell you, kind of, it's a throwback to what Steve Jobs said about the technology that he gave his kids access to. My son got almost no technology until the coronavirus pandemic. He's 7. And he had no TV, no tablets, nothing like that.
He must have been feeling like he's deprived compared to his friends.
Well, now he fixes my laptop, and it's been 3 months. Okay, that's basically what's going on. He was thrown into the deep end of technology because we were all shut in, and he had to do first grade, and it was Zoom and Google Classroom and so on. So what do I hope he is taught? He needs to be taught the critical thinking skills that we were taught about how to evaluate ideas and evidence and so on, but in a digital sense. Because
unfortunately, we weren't all taught that either, but go on.
Right, okay, so I would hope that he is taught how to think about evidence, sources, veracity, but in the context of digital delivery of all of that information. I also hope that he is taught about how what he says and does online impacts the world, how other people think, the feelings of others, and how digital technology can be a lightning quick emotional conduit that may not feel that way for the purveyor of the information itself. So I guess a short answer to your question is, I want him to be taught how to be critical, both about the consumption and about the production of information that he's engaging in online.
And presumably you would want the teachers to do something equivalent to reading your book, because they can't teach it if they don't understand it. And very few adults even understand most of this, like almost any of it, right?
Well, I hope everyone reads my book, David, so.
Well, of course. I guess we have to wrap. There's so much to talk to you about. Oh, I wanted to ask one last question. Josh
Yeah.
might be annoyed. One of the things you say early on in the book is that in order to address these issues, the leaders of these companies and systems themselves must, among other things, put social welfare above shareholder value, which is, in my opinion, not what's happening now, and is frankly highly unlikely. But is that a given to you, that almost in effect, profits will be affected by doing the right thing?
No, so I actually, I go one step further, which is, and I say in that quote that you're reading, if you read the end of that sentence, and I don't have the book in front of me, so I'm going to misquote myself, but essentially they should understand that those two values or missions are aligned, that by putting social value first, they will actually improve their long-term profitability.
Okay.
Okay.
They don't understand that now, I would presume.
They don't understand that now. They're going for the short-term profit, but what they're failing to recognize, some are more than others, is that they face an existential crisis that could destroy the long-term revenue stream if everybody is completely disillusioned with what they're doing, and the quote unquote delete Facebook movement really succeeds. And so I think that at the end of the day, societal welfare and company shareholder value and societal value are aligned. And the sooner they recognize that, the better for all of us.
Wonderful forward-looking statement to end with. So thank you so much, Sinan.
Thank you.
Josh.
Appreciate all of you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone. Sorry we couldn't get to more questions. The hour blew by. We look forward to seeing you at a future roundtable. So thanks again for joining us.